All right. So this is the question: was PG&E the first climate change bankruptcy? So PG&E, the largest utility in California, declared bankruptcy after being held liable for the California wildfires a while back. And a Wall Street Journal news story called this the first climate change bankruptcy, and then was asking, are we prepared for lots more to come? And the key quote from the article is, quote, California's largest utility was overwhelmed by rapid climatic.
Climatic. It's an annoying word.
Changes as a prolonged drought dried out much of the state and decimated forests, dramatically increasing the risks of fire. And I think this story is an example of a wider pattern whenever we're reading about energy, which is that there's some disaster, it's attributed to climate change, and then we're encouraged to see this as grounds for doing something about climate change. And usually what that means is that we're basically helpless to cope with climate except by depriving ourselves of fossil fuel energy. And I think the reality is much more complicated in one sense, but it's actually much more optimistic in another. And I want to talk about the role that climate trends may have played in this. But then this was, I think, overwhelmingly a failure of government policy and possibly corporate decision making. But I wanted to ask a couple questions of Stefan, who's researched the California wildfires in quite a bit of depth, that I think it would be a helpful context here. So Stefan, can you just kind of give us at a high level, what are the major causes of wildfires?
Well, so the immediate causes of wildfires are ignition events. So wildfires don't just come along because something gets a little warmer in the atmosphere or so. So we actually need an ignition event. And unfortunately, particularly in California, most or the overwhelming number of wildfires are being started by human causes. So, PG&E landlines creating sparks is one example. Others are accidents that cause fires or even arsonry. And so recent research by the United States Geological Survey indicates that something like 95 to 100% of fires in certain areas of California are actually ignited by human causes. And an additional side to this, of course, is which refers to the climate issue, is the available of fuel for the fire. So the biomass in forms of trees or grass and the vegetation that dries out and then serves as a fuel to fire. So that's an important factor. And in California, particularly, also the wind patterns play a role.
And what evidence do we have that the warming of the planet has contributed to the increased fires in California, or increased risk of fires?
So the general theory is, as the planet in terms of the atmosphere, but also very importantly in terms of the oceans, warms up, we might see prolonged seasons of dryness or drought in California. So that there will be a pattern of wet and dry phases, and the dry phases will be prolonged. And in the wet phases, more trees and grassland and so on are growing to later in the dry phase then serve as fuel. So there's some plausibility to this. Whether this will emerge as a long-term pattern, we will see. It's very difficult to attribute any given event to climate change as such. But there's some plausibility that this will have an impact on the potential of fires. Now, as I mentioned, like 95 to 100% of fires caused by humans in terms of ignition events, that gives you some perspective that's more under our control. And there are also a couple of other things to consider. So, for example, we have some evidence from sediment studies and also historic records that in California and elsewhere, before the 1900s, the size and number of wildfires was actually larger than today. And there was a significant collapse in fire threat during the 20th century. And so what happened? And so the modern era is called the period of the modern fire deficit. Why deficit? Because compared to the natural threat level of wildfires, we are actually in a period of fire suppression, meaning human through technology, managing the landscape and so on, have managed to drastically reduce the threat of fire that is naturally occurring. And so that's a perspective. The long-term perspective is an actual decline in fire threat. Unfortunately, patterns like increasing population growth in California combined with settling in more vulnerable spots creates recently more victims of fires.
I want to jump in for a second on this, just to talk about what I think is the appropriate attitude for a human being to have toward climate-related dangers and also climate-related opportunities. And I think of the proper attitude as one of mastery, that we should seek to master climate, which means that we can neutralize a whole bunch of different climate threats, and then we can also enhance climate in all sorts of ways so that we can make just about any climate livable. And when we see a particular situation like, okay, fires, the attitude has to be, okay, there's got to be a way that we can master this area, even if it was getting 3 times worse in terms of just the natural hostility. And there's nothing like that. But even if there was, how we want to figure out, let's figure out a technological and infrastructure engineering type solution. Where's the can-do attitude here? Where's the Elon Musk saying, okay, let's figure out how to master this thing. Let's figure out how to have, whatever. Let's figure out how to make sure that we have patterns of forests or brush or whatever that deprive big fires of fuel. Let's just really figure this thing out. And that should be the attitude toward every aspect of climate. There's very much this fatalism and this almost desire for retribution for our sins, where people think, yeah, we're doing something bad, we're changing climate, and so all that we can do is withdraw. Let's just stop doing stuff, and then the climate will be nice to us. And the climate won't be nice to us. And why should we think that way? Why shouldn't we just figure out, okay, let's really crack these things. Let's figure out how to deal with different things. Even sea levels, which we've talked about internally, that's I think the hardest one. But where's the can-do attitude toward those different things so that we can be progressively masters of any form of climate, including, and if we do that, then we'll be better off now, and all of our not ancestors, but all of our kin, I guess, in the future will be grateful to us because we'll have innovated all these technologies that will benefit them in all of the crazy climate changes to come in the next millions and so years. So that's just, there's a fundamental problem where there's not this can-do attitude of mastery. There's this can't-do attitude of fatalism and just and retraction. And that saves nobody now, because what good does it do if you use slightly less gas or something in your home? Like, is that really going to protect people from fires? No. It's just going to make your life a little bit worse. Whereas if we really invested in mastery, then there would just be huge current and future benefits.
Just to add one point to this. So one could argue about a climate policy playing a role for, the wildfire safety in the future, like in the second half of the 21st century. But whatever you do in domestic policy or California policy, it won't matter for the next couple of decades of wildfire seasons. So it's pretty telling that people are immediately jumping, first we need a climate policy. And, after that, they might say something, we also need to do some forest management. So this won't help the people in the immediate future. And so the right debate would be about what will, decreasing CO2 emissions do for the people living in the second half of the 21st century or even beyond that. So it's not an immediate policy discussion that it should be inserted in.